year ago, I had never heard the term spiritual bypassing, and why would I? I had fallen into Tibetan Buddhism in Rigpa with Sogyal Rinpoche, Sogyal Lakar, as my teacher. And spiritual bypassing just simply isn't part of that tradition. It's not something that they know about. Now, when you're a Tibetan Buddhist student and you're being taught by someone who thinks that, their system has got everything, you tend to think that it's perfect. You tend to think that, yes, Tibetan Buddhism has got the answers to everything, and this is all that I need. And, I think it would be if it was being taught by a truly qualified teacher. And by truly qualified, in this day and age, I mean someone who's not just well versed in the Tibetan Buddhist system, but someone who also knows about the dangers, who knows about the dangers of misunderstanding some of the teachings, the sort of misunderstandings that lead to lamas being able to abuse people and students actually just like watching that and thinking it's absolutely fine. Now that's obviously it's obviously a problem. And in the modern world, you need teachers who understand where that line is and make sure that their students understand that, for instance, the whole idea of criticising a lama or not criticising a lama, doesn't mean that you should watch them doing something obviously harmful and say nothing about it. That there's a purpose for that particular teaching, but it doesn't ask you to actually drop your discernment. So, that sort of thing. You need teachers who are quite clear on that. And also I think they need to be clear on, some of the Western psychological discoveries, like spiritual bypassing, so that they know to make sure that their students don't also fall into that. Because actually, it's something that I think was fostered in my childhood through the way I was brought up, and I think it's fostered in our society a bit. And I'm coming from a Christian background, and that is that negative emotions is like bad, and like we don't want it, and we push it away, which is quite normal. Nobody wants the bad stuff, right? But a spiritual practice, a spiritual philosophy really should be helping you to work through your stuff, to transcend it, to take it onto your path, and to move on from it in a healthy way. It shouldn't be asking you to repress it or just put it aside, ignoring it, and going on thinking that everything's fine. And that's what spiritual bypassing is. Spiritual bypassing is, okay, you've got an issue, you've got some issue in your life, maybe you've got an abusive husband or an abusive lama, and you're actually feeling really conflicted about that, and you've really got an issue there that you have to sort out. But instead of actually sitting down and examining it and looking at it and going, okay, well, what's going on here and what do I need to do? No, you just go, I'm going to just let it all go. I'm just going to let it all go. I'm just going to be here now, and I'm not going to get stuck in it, and all of those kind of things. But in actual fact, you can't let it go until you've dealt with it, because it'll keep on coming up, and it will get worse and worse and worse. And in actual fact, in these instances, the letting go is not just letting go, it's repressing. It's using letting go as an active kind of thing. Now, I can't tell you how many times I raised, questions or issues or whatever in Rigpa, and I was told to let it go. And I realise now it's a way of shutting people up. Just don't get involved. Don't let it bother you. It's just concepts. It's just thoughts. And, those kind of things, it's like, well, sure, fine. There's a certain truth in that. I mean, yeah, let's not let these things really, bother us. Let's not let, little light things irritate us. We could spend our whole life being terribly, terribly irritated. But, when something's really awful is happening, that's not something that we should be letting go. That's something we should be doing something about, right? And when we've got, a personal issue that really we need to actually sit down and examine and sort out, just letting it go is actually pushing it away. I don't know at what point I realised this. I think it was at some stage after I had discovered the level of abuse in Rigpa, the kind of things Sogyal Rinpoche was actually doing to people that I knew. And I was trying to use what I'd learned in Rigpa to deal with my feelings. And I recognised that it wasn't working, basically. And I recognised that in the end, I actually just had to sit with that horrible, horrible, horrible feeling of betrayal, of grief, of disappointment, all of that kind of stuff. I had to sit with it and be with that and allow it to process in me. And you totally just be with it. I mean, those words are so good. You just have to sit there and feel it. Because that's what's happening. That's what's presenting itself to you in that moment. And out of that came some clarity, came some release, and came some sort of processing. So those feelings started to just dissolve on their own. And then I realized I don't have to drop it. They drop naturally by themselves when they're ready to drop. And I realized then that the way I'd been meditating had been spiritually bypassing. I had been using it to basically not feel. To not feel my outrage, to not feel my discomfort, to not feel any kind of negative emotion. And the teachings on the kleshas, which are, basically your negative feelings, you sort of, you come away from those teachings which talk about basically attachment, aversion, ignorance, jealousy, and pride or arrogance as being bad. You can easily have a Buddhist education and think that these emotions are bad, and you're making efforts to get rid of those emotions. And what can happen is, because you're trying really hard to be this very spiritual person in terms of this belief system, what can happen is that you're just totally repressing those emotions in yourself. And when you're sitting in a retreat situation and a lama's coming in, someone that you have devotion for and someone that you think's, pretty cool, and that you think can introduce you to the nature of mind and lead you to enlightenment. When he comes in and he sits there and he starts growling at people around him, and what you're actually seeing is, something that's pretty nasty, and it's just not nice, it's not, and it isn't what you would expect from a spiritual teacher. But instead of, every time you see that, instead of still allowing yourself to feel that discomfort and that sense that this is not right, which would have actually, if we had felt that, then we would have known it was wrong, before it got to the stage that it did. We would have sort of gone, no, this is not right. I mean, at least we would have left. I mean, a lot of people did. They saw that and they went, nah, I'm out of here, this is really warped. But no, we were taught not only that what we were seeing was actually an example of love and that it was training and therefore a good thing, but we were also taught to allow our risings to come up, to not pay them any attention, and to just allow them to go. So again, on the surface that sounds fine, but in practice we were spiritually bypassing, because we were sitting there with these feelings of, oh, this is awful, coming up, and we were letting them go, but we weren't examining the wisdom in those feelings. Even in the teachings, the negative emotions have a positive side. They have wisdom in them. And, we were taught that, sort of, some lip service given to that, but it wasn't taught that way in practice, because rather than being taught to allow these feelings to arise and to see the wisdom in them, no, we were just taught to basically spiritually bypass our feelings, just to let them go. And, for instance, anger, the wisdom in that is mirror-like wisdom. So in actual fact, in anger, there's immense clarity which allows you to see very clearly. But, we weren't encouraged to actually see the wisdom in our discomfort, because had we seen the wisdom in it, we would have recognized that what we were seeing was not kindness. So, if you think that you were taught, basically good stuff in Rigpa, I'm sorry, you were taught spiritual bypassing. Now, it's possible that, some people didn't take it like that. And I must admit that my upbringing and, our Western society in general does tend to encourage us to repress our emotions anyway. So, it is quite likely that most of us probably in Rigpa were probably spiritually bypassing. A Lama who understands that this is a trap that people can fall into would rather teach something like Sokni Rinpoche talks about handshake, having a handshake with your feelings. In other words, acknowledging them, actually recognizing that they're there and touching them with your awareness. And then they can dissolve naturally. You don't have to let them go. They just, you've recognized that they're there and you've felt them. You've felt what they have brought up in you, whatever that is. And even if it's very uncomfortable, you sit with that, you feel that, because that's your reality at that particular time. And you allow whatever wisdom is in that feeling to rise up for you as insight, because if you're actually sitting there in meditation and these things are coming up, and you've got a good meditation, then you can see clearly, and that's your insight into the situation, and then you'll know what you need to do or not do or whatever, or it will just release by itself and then it will go. So, teachers who teach like that, you're not going to fall into spiritual bypassing, I would say, well, much less likely to with a teacher like that, because they're teaching you to acknowledge your feelings and to acknowledge the wisdom in them or the message in them before you do that. Now, I'm probably quite lucky because in many ways, because before I came to Tibetan Buddhism, I'd done a lot of work on my own beliefs and my own issues from childhood, and I had done a lot of, really deep examination of the baggage that I carried, from my childhood. And Tibetan Buddhism doesn't encourage you to do that. Well, certainly not the way I was taught in Rigpa. And I haven't seen anything anywhere that suggests that, we should actually look at our issues or our difficulties or any of that. It's all very much about, watering the seeds of joy. Which, that's fine, that's good too, because obviously it's a matter of balance. You can dwell on the negative to such an extent that you can't see the positive. So, that's definitely valid. But if you ignore and deny the negative, that's also unhealthy. Yeah? So, and this is what we would do. This is really what was happening in Rigpa. Totally. And the closer you were to Soga Rinpoche, the more you saw that was negative, and the more difficult and the more challenge you had, and the more struggles you had in, just working under those conditions of, a highly demanding person. And so the more negative stuff there was there in front of you that you really did need to deal with for the sake of your own health. And yet, we were taught to simply not see it for what it really was. We were seeing it as a training and as a positive thing. And that's not to say that sometimes, if we are someone who is prepared to work with every negative situation in our life in a way that we can learn from it and grow from it, then all situations can have a positive effect for us in the long run. But that doesn't mean that we should run around doing horrible things to people thinking that it's going to be good for their spiritual progress, that's a real twist. I think that's a really bad twist of that idea that we can grow from difficult situations. To put somebody in a difficult situation thinking, well, this is going to make them grow. I don't think any person should do that to any other person. And the fact that, lamas think that they can do that, there's something twisted in that idea. It's like using the idea of karma to walk past a beggar and not give them any money. It's like saying, oh, well, that's their karma, so we'll just leave them to suffer. That's a distortion of, or an incorrect view on the concept of karma, I think, because, yeah, it may be their karma to be a beggar in this life, but for your karma, you should be helping them. You should be helping them out, because if you walk past and ignore them, well, that's not beneficial for your karma. If we just look at it from a selfish point of view. And, this whole idea that, okay, well, Sogil was supposedly enlightened and therefore this wasn't actually harm and he was just being spontaneous, and everything that, a Buddha does spontaneously benefits people. Well, that's true if you actually are a Buddha, but then an actual Buddha would not be actually harming anybody, which means that, if you look at the crazy wisdom stories from Tibetan Buddhism, they are very rare. This kind of behavior is rare. It's to a very close student, very specific situation. It's not somebody who just goes around, beating everybody up. So, the whole thing was twisted from the start in that, people were believing that this person was enlightened and he's clearly not. And why? Why were they not seeing that? Why was their mind not going, well, that hurt, and I've got a bruise, and, the next day that bruise is getting worse. It's not spontaneously healed like the stories of the true crazy wisdom masters. It's not spontaneously healed like the wounds were when a real crazy wisdom master did something to a disciple that, woke them up. No, this isn't that, it's not that, because people have got scars, So at some point there, their perception was they were basically being gaslighted, to think that what they saw was positive or was good or was beneficial, when actually it wasn't. So, this is actually spiritual bypassing on a huge scale, like a huge scale. It's a mass delusion, a whole cult. I was going to say a whole sangha, but, it's a whole cult. Whole cult of people sitting there seeing something and thinking it is something else, because we've been brainwashed into believing that it was something else. So, spiritual bypassing. Yeah. So what does it mean to not spiritually bypass? It means to sit with the shit. It means to acknowledge your pain, acknowledge your suffering, to recognize the feelings and be with the feelings without trying to push them away. It doesn't mean getting caught up in them. It doesn't mean going over and over and over them again. It doesn't mean not letting them go. It means actually working through them, actually, dealing with them. And then you can let them go. But, if people say to me now, oh, just let it go, and they're using it as a way to shut me up, oh boy, I see that really clearly now. It's like, wait a minute, you're not telling me to let it go because you think it'll be beneficial for me. No, you're telling me to let it go because you don't want to talk about it anymore, because you don't want to deal with it. And, that's how it was in Rigpa. So, watch out for your meditation instructions if you were taught by Rigpa. And frankly, if you're still being taught by Rigpa, just be really careful, A, And even maybe, like, if you're still going there, you know, raise the question. It's like, how do we make sure we're not spiritually bypassing here? And is there anything in the instructions that you're getting that ask you to actually acknowledge your feeling? Meditation gives you the ability to step back from your thoughts and emotions so you can watch them. You can watch them kind of working through yourself, and you can see them and be with them. And, you know, that's good because it allows us to be with our emotions without being swamped by them. But if your meditation instructions are not allowing you to actually acknowledge those feelings and feel those feelings, if your meditation instructions are asking you to let them go, let them go, let them go, before you've actually acknowledged them, that's teaching you to spiritually bypass. And there's a lack in those meditation instructions. So, and I also think, you know, like an emphasis on, you know, lots of chanting and, you know, visualization practices and that. I mean, there's a role and there's a purpose and there's a place for those practices. But in Rigpa, it was like, you know, once you got to a certain stage, everybody was supposed to go to do these group chanting and visualization practices, you know, for an hour and a half a day on retreat. You just put everything aside and then you go and you do these practices, and it's lovely. It's a relief, you know. It's a bit like getting stoned or drunk. You know, you have relief from your issues for a while because you know you're going off somewhere else. It's really a distraction from your issues. But when you come back, you've still got those issues, and you'll always have those issues until you deal with them. And, you know, it's like people who, with the whole Rigpa debacle, say, oh, you know, I've dropped that, I've moved on. But they haven't sat down and actually looked at how they feel about it, what it means for them in their spiritual path, and they haven't looked back to see how they were manipulated, what was good, what was bad about their situation. You know, those things do actually have to be acknowledged and considered, and then you can move on, and, you know, then you can drop them. I mean, then they drop by themselves. You don't have to actually drop them, you know. I mean, dropping's supposed to be just like, you know, letting go, but in Rigpa, dropping was was more like squashing. So there you go. That's spiritual bypassing. You know, that's how it was kind of taught to us. Not like, oh, well, we're teaching you to spiritually bypass. And it's completely unconscious. But the whole culture of the cult is just such that we had to spiritually bypass in order to accept all that crap. And when I say we, you know, I'm talking about the big we, but I mean, obviously the closer you got to the abuse, the worse it was, and the more you had to disassociate yourself, basically, from what was happening in front of you in order for you to handle it. You know, because when you see somebody be actually like punched, you know, seriously punched, your normal human reaction is, that's not right. And that's the sort of reaction you should be having, and that's the sort of reaction you should be acknowledging and acting from. But what happened is that the people would see that. They might have, you know, they'd probably have that normal reaction, but then they'd go, just going to let that go. That's just arising. Well, yeah, it is arising, but it's arising, it's because it's telling you something. It's telling you that what you're seeing is not right, and something has to be done about it, you know, and you can't just sit there and not say anything, you know. So, yeah, there it is, spiritual bypassing. So I've learnt to sit with the shadow, sit with the discomfort, the grief, the pain, the embarrassment, you know, all of that. And it's painful, but it's also very, very freeing to actually just allow yourself to be freaking miserable. Because life's like that, you know, sometimes everything is miserable. And pushing away misery, you know, trying to hide it, trying to squash it, doesn't work in the long run. It just festers away there. And yeah, so anyway, I think, I don't think people should mix up Buddhism and psychotherapy and stuff. I think they should be two separate disciplines, if you like. But I do think it's a really good idea for people to do some work on themselves before they actually enter Tibetan Buddhism. Or certainly before they enter the Vajrayana, or even before they do any meditation at all. I don't know, but I mean, at some point we all have to look at ourselves and our background and our beliefs and our bad habits, and I don't know, it's kind of a lot, I guess. But it is the sort of work that people do with counsellors and therapists, and you know, I think there is a great deal of benefit in doing that kind of work, you know, before you hit the Mahayana teachings, definitely, you know, because you've got all of these teachings there about, you know, putting yourself last, about having compassion for other people such that you're more concerned about them than you are about you. Now, if you don't already have a healthy sense of self, then those kind of ideas are actually quite damaging. You have to be clear about, you know, who you are, and you have to be happy with yourself and comfortable with yourself and value yourself before you can approach those teachings in a healthy way, I think. Otherwise, you end up being a doormat. You become a doormat for an abuser. It's not because the Lojong teachings or the compassion teachings, you know, they do say to have love for yourself, but that's not what's emphasized. And those teachings were for a society that had as their basic kind of cultural ground a sense that everyone had Buddha nature, and so everybody was a basically good, strong person. Our Western culture is not like that. Our basic ground is that we're all flawed. You know, we're born flawed. That's the Western basic cultural ground, which has come from our Christian upbringing. So then you put teachings onto that were designed for a culture where people felt basically good about themselves, and you put that into a culture where most people probably don't feel good about themselves, and you just have major issues in misinterpreting. If you don't teach those things and make sure that people know that it's based on, the whole thing is based on you actually having a sense of your own goodness and your own strength, then you have a problem. You know, then you have people misunderstanding it. And the way the teachings are weighted means it isn't much time or even, you know, mention of the fact that when you're loving all people, you know, that actually includes you. In fact, you're supposed to include yourself first. So, I mean, there's loving kindness practice for self. You know, that's usually how that compassion practices are started and taught. But, you know, if you grow up thinking you're never going to be good enough, you know, thinking there's something wrong with you, something fundamentally wrong with you, then, you know, a few loving kindness for self meditation practice is not going to do it for you. You know, you really have to look deeper than that at why you feel like that. I mean, you have to admit for a start that you feel like that. But where do we have time? Certainly that's not, you know, that wasn't part of the compassion practices. There wasn't any time or any place in the teachings for actually looking at where we are now and how we feel about ourselves, you know, before we start diving into being more concerned about other people. So, yeah, so it's just not as simple as taking a religion from another culture and plonking it into a culture which has a very different ground, you know, basic ground of how people perceive themselves. So, there we have it. Beware of spiritual bypassing. That's all I've got for today. If you found it useful, like it, share it, all of that kind of stuff, comment, whatever. And yeah, I'll catch you next time. Bye.